so in the death of Jesus, when he's on the cross, and he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? You can try a lot of parallels to the Garden of Gethsemane,
Yeah.
right? And I also was thinking about when I was reading this, when you were saying about Simon and how it's almost like the people who have to wrestle and doubt a little bit are the ones who have the strongest, end up having the strongest
Hmm.
faith and the strongest connection. It's like um, even Jesus, right, who has the strongest faith in his Father, is the divine. He's wrestling with it in the same way that Jacob or Israel wrestles with God. Um,
Right. Or
Jesus,
Job or anyone else who's a
yeah,
figure like that, where at the moment where, the darkest moment that occurs, it's always this idea that you would have doubts because that's just
yeah.
how our nature is, right?
Like if it's almost if Jesus just went to the cross, was like, all right, take me, cool, crucified, yep, all good, cool, okay, and it's just standing there, like there would be no passion in that.
And that directly relates to when they arrest him and he talks about the legions of angels. Because again, the point is, and that's they're not getting it, right? The people who are there mocking him and saying all these things like, "Wow, well, if you're really the son of God, like, why can't you just get out of it? And why are you having regrets and all this?" It's again, they're not getting that the real thing that he's doing is assuming a human nature and then experiencing death, which is what has plagued the human nature since the Garden of Eden,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're not really understanding that the real problem is not his divine nature getting out of this human problem, right? I mean, if like he said, that's not the problem. If he wanted to, he could just leave. And like you just said it, if it was just his divine nature, then he would just not experience anything. Right, it wouldn't be the same thing. But it's because the actual thing which he needs to do is to resurrect the human nature. He assumes the human nature, and then of course he experiences the human nature as well.
Um, there's a very interesting parallel here between this and Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac.
Yes.
Um, and I'm going to bring up a little bit of Kierkegaard because that's what I did my diss on. And I happen to know a decent amount about. But um, essentially, Kierkegaard argues that in the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac, what makes that an act of faith is that Isaac is the most important thing to Abraham. It's not that like Abraham is willing to do it and he doesn't feel anything, right, when he gives up Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
It's that he loves Isaac and is willing to give it up in spite of the fact that he values Isaac so much, right? So much more than anybody else, right? Isaac is the thing that he loves the most. And I think there's a strong parallel here, whether that be like Jesus giving himself up and his life up, or God giving his son Jesus up.
Right. It's
Um,
it's God the Father giving up the his most treasured
right.
son, right? And it's interesting because the way that happens is, yeah, it's exactly like the Abraham Isaac idea, because there it's kind of like, okay, you have to have faith in God, but like God is not going to experience what Abraham experienced in that moment. But then later on in the New Testament, it's like, well, he is, right?
Right.
Because and even worse, because we actually go through with the crucifixion. It's not just
Exactly. And I think that is because, right, the testament to faith is, right, he's giving himself. He's offering his son. He's willing to give his son, the one that he loves, to God,
right.
right? But what does God do in this story? He gives, his son to the world.
Yeah, he's willing to give his son
He
to us, right?
reverses it, right? Like
Right.
like he gives the act of faith. He does the act of faith, you know, unto us. He does what Abraham does, but he doesn't have to.
Right, and I think that relates back to probably probably the most unbelievable thing for people is that the idea here is that God has faith in humanity.
Right.
And that's the thing that I think humans don't believe. Maybe more than the actual idea of God, because this we see even this with Genesis, right, where he creates the world, and every time he says that that creation is good,
Right.
right, and that's like the main message of Genesis. It's not that he created the world; it's that the creation which he did was good.
Right.
That's why it was created in the first place. And then here we have again this idea that it can be restored, and he still has faith in humanity.
But there's a lot of times in the Old Testament when he creates humanity and then they gives them orders and they fail to do it, and then he like kind of restarts, and there's a lot
Right.
of this stuff. And this is the moment, again, I think you nailed it, where it's like, this is the moment where, it's like, this has to be, to me, this has to be the turning point, because it is the moment where God turns around and actually says, I have faith in humanity. Right? He does that act he gives up his son to humanity. And it's not that he doesn't value, again, what I was relating it to was when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And all these things in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's valuing life, he doesn't want to do it. It's not that he's just like, whatever, life. I don't give a shit about human life, and I'm just going to do this and go off to he cares about his human life. It means a lot to him.
Right, but he knows that to save humanity and to save the whole human nature, he has to go through with this, and that's why it's so interesting. And again, because in theology, at least in the theology, the will is a property of the nature of things. Because Jesus is also divine, then he also shares the divine will that God the Father and the Spirit share. So what's happening here is not that he's being forcefully put in this position. He's going along with his own divine will, but again, it's the human will which is familiar to us, so we know it, that doubts even till the moment of death, right? Because he's already gone through with it, but it's still that human will of, yes, but like it's suffering, it's this world, it's all we know, right? And then that's the duality of it that we talked about before.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.